and welcome to a conversation with several members of our community. This is a program that's done in cooperation with West Hartford Community Access and the League of Women Voters of Greater Hartford. Joining me today are Dr. Walton Brown Foster, Professor of Political Science at Central Connecticut State University, Adrian Cochran, Chief Executive Officer of the Hartford Region YWCA, Val Ramos, who is the Director of Strategic Alliances and Equity Officer of Everyday Democracy, and Patricia Rossi, Vice President of Advocacy and Public Issues for the League of Women Voters of Connecticut. I am Carol Mulready, and I am the Chair of Voter Service for the League of Women Voters of Greater Hartford. So our program today was intended to help voters understand a little bit about early voting, to inform them that there is going to be a question on the ballot. That is something that we have discovered over the last several weeks, but certainly as we get closer and closer to the election, that people are not aware that it's on the ballot. So an important piece is to let you, the voters listening to us, know that in addition to making your important choices regarding who represents you in the constitutional offices, like governor, secretary of the state, attorney general, and so forth, and your state representative, and your U.S. Congress representatives, there is a referendum question on the ballot on early voting. The question specifically is, shall the Constitution of the state be amended to permit the General Assembly to provide for early voting? Voters can vote yes or no. A yes vote supports amending the state constitution to authorize the state legislature to provide by law in-person early voting before an election. A no vote opposes amending the Constitution, thereby maintaining that early voting would not be authorized in this state. So setting the stage, what is the situation that we are discussing today? Early voting allows all eligible voters, also called electors, to cast their ballot in person on specified days before Election Day. The voter does not need to provide a reason for wanting to vote early. Currently, voters in Connecticut may vote in person only on Election Day or by submitting an absentee ballot for one of 6 reasons that we can discuss later if we wish. We know that 46 states and the District of Columbia already allow early voting. So we might conclude that there is something helpful about early voting for voters, and we will be bringing that up today. Only 4 states do not have some form of early voting: Connecticut, New Hampshire, Alabama, and Mississippi. Why doesn't Connecticut have early voting? Because our Constitution requires that voters shall appear in person on Election Day to vote. So the ballot that you have, that we all will receive when we go to vote or when we get an absentee ballot, will have a choice of yes or no on this question. So it's important that you find the question on your ballot. And if a yes vote succeeds, our elected officials will be authorized to develop an early voting program for Connecticut. If a majority of voters say no, there will be no program and procedure to have early voting in our state. So that's an overview, and we are going to have our panelists discuss what their perspectives are. And we're going to start with Dr. Walton Brown Foster, who will give us some context on early voting from a historical and more global perspective on how it fits into the issues of voter access. Dr. Walton Brown Foster is a professor in the Department of Political Science at Central Connecticut State University. She is coordinating faculty member of the African American Studies program, in which she teaches, and is also an editor-in-chief of the online journal 1619, Journal of African American Studies. She has a doctorate in political science from the University of Michigan. Her areas of research and teaching are wide, from Latin American and African politics to religion and politics and African American race and ethnic politics. She has taught at the University of Georgia and Yale University and has been the lead course developer and instructor of online courses at Charter Oak College in Connecticut. Professional affiliations include the American and New England Political Science Associations and membership in Pi Sigma Alpha and Alpha Sigma Lambda honor societies. She is a life member of Delta Sigma Theta sorority and currently a member and leader of the Greater Hartford, Connecticut Charter of the Links Incorporated. Welcome, Dr. Brown Foster.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And I am so appreciative of this opportunity to talk about something that I talk about every time I'm in the classroom, and that is the state of democracy and the value of democracy. And I always begin my classes, regardless of whether or not students have taken classes with me before, with very basic definitions. And the basic definition that I start with is, as it relates to democracy, presents the concept of democracy as a tent with pillars. And one of the essential pillars of the tent of democracy is elections. We are currently in a period domestically and internationally in which there is a heightened sense and unease about the global state of democratic ideals, beliefs, and systems. Democracy seems to be in peril. Autocracy seems to be on the rise. The resiliency of democracy is being tested, and the very legitimacy of democratic processes, such as elections, seem to be under attack, not only here in the United States, but also globally. Some suggest that the COVID-19 pandemic exacerbated a trend of increasing authoritarianism across the globe, with many countries sliding back down the democratic scale. And that's according to the Sweden Stockholm Institute for Democracy. However, I would suggest that the trend that political scientists call democratic backsliding can be traced back decades. So we are in the midst of a culmination of a very long process. The trend is measured by increasing numbers of efforts to reduce and limit, rather than increase and expand opportunities for citizens at home and across the globe to acquire and exercise their individual vote. The right to vote is the evidence that we use as a measure of an individual's inclusion in a system of government by and for the people. It is the certification and guarantee of an individual franchise. Elections and election rules determine the manner in which one can exercise that franchise, and it's also a measure of the health of elections, which is a fundamental measure of the state of democracy in a political context. The health of elections is measured in terms of the rules, such as who has the right to vote, who has the franchise, and most importantly, when and how that franchise can be exercised. The opportunity to vote is critical in determining the health of a democracy, in other words, and the facilitation of the fundamental principle of suffrage. In the US, the facilitation of suffrage and the main guardians of the exercise of the franchise is held by the 50 individual states. States and their politics within each state can determine who votes and how they vote. We are witnessing troubling efforts in many states to roll back the exercise of the franchise by some in favor of a few. We are also seeing troubling signs in which the very legitimacy of election outcomes is challenged. Ironically, the cure for democracy under stress is elections. The expansion of opportunities to participate in elections through the exercise of one's vote is a part of the cure. At this time, as was stated earlier, Connecticut is one of 4 states that does not offer early voting opportunities. And I think it's quite ironic that Connecticut finds itself in the company of Mississippi and Alabama, especially when we see overall many other troubling signs of limiting the right to vote, the access to the polls, and therefore correcting these problems is in fact a defense of democracy. It's a counter to many of the overall troubling signs that we find at this time in our country. As the first democratic republic in modern world history, the world continues to watch the United States, and it continues to measure their democracies up against our democracy. And the state of our democracy matters. What we say is closely scrutinized along with what we do and how we do it as a nation. We remain a beacon and model of democratic possibilities, values, and ideals. And the state of Connecticut is one of the remaining 50 state guardians of those ideals. And at this moment in time, early voting in Connecticut will be one step further, one of the few remaining actions that will continue to show the world that we are in fact a democracy committed to what we say. And as we continue to strengthen our democracy at home, we are also strengthening the concept of democracy abroad while we are countering some of the anti-democratic forces that seem to be gaining ground throughout the world. So I will end my comments there and look forward to hearing from each of my co-panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Brown Foster. Very interesting perspectives and helpful, I think, for this discussion. Turning now to our first panelist, we will hear from Adrian Cochran, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the YWCA of the Hartford region. Adrian serves traditionally underserved and disenfranchised individuals, families, and communities. Her work passionately centers on racial and gender equity by disrupting and dismantling inequitable systems. As CEO, Adrian leads an effective executive leadership team to achieve its mission and critical goals. and create a lasting impact on women, girls, and families, with a focus on women and girls of color. She serves on the board of the Prosperity Foundation, St. Francis Hospital and Medical Center, Teach for America Connecticut, American Red Cross Connecticut and Rhode Island chapters, and the University of Connecticut Hartford Board of Advocates. She has bachelor and master's degrees from Tuskegee University and a Juris Doctorate from St. Louis University School of Law. She has received numerous awards and honors for her commitment to social justice, community service, and change. Recently, she was named one of Hartford Business Journal's top 25 women in business. Welcome, Dr. Cochran, and we are very happy to have you here because I know not only is your mission that of women and families, you serve a lot of young women, and that is certainly a population that we know is important to the future of our democracy. So I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the League of Women Voters for organizing such an important discussion on early voting. I'm certainly honored to share this panel with each of you, but especially honored to share this time with my good friend and the international political scientist, Dr. Walton Brown Foster. That was so inspiring, everything you had to say. So just over 2 weeks ago, I was with your past president, Carol Reimer, and a group of notable women historians and fellow feminists as we celebrated voting, the right to suffrage, and the accomplishments of 4 Connecticut Black women by unveiling a plaque on the wall of the Capitol. Since 2021, the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, the League of Women Voters has honored 29 Black women. YWCA Hartford Region applauds you for 100 plus years of work for liberty, freedom, and democracy when it comes to the right to vote for all. On behalf of YWCA Hartford Region, we unequivocally support Connecticut's first question on the November 8 election ballot, amending the state constitution to authorize the state legislature to provide by law for in-person early voting before an election. We have experienced and continue to encounter a controversial political season when it comes to social justice, anti-racism, gender equity, and body autonomy. Our last US presidential election continues to wreak havoc with vestiges of racial tension remaining that question who we are as Americans. The 2020 election provides striking examples of the connection between Black and Brown political participation, voter suppression, and restrictive voting legislation. YWCA celebrates social justice and the suffragist movement dating all the way back to 1915, when Addie Hunton, an African-American suffragette, worked with 2 other Black women to team with the YWCA, and this was during World War I, to support segregated Black troops. The YWCA took a provocative position when Jim Crow thrived in the South and the racial divide continued in the North. From past to present, YWCA USA, including the 4 state associations, have been on the front lines of civic engagement and voter involvement with our Get Out the Vote campaign. Your voice, your vote, your future. YWCA Hartford Region proudly hosts a polling station in our building. We believe that early voting means election day lines are shorter, and poll workers and election administrators can devote more time to making sure voting processes are operating efficiently and effectively and as they're meant to. Early voting also inspires voter confidence. This is key for encouraging active participation in our elections. An early voting period before Election Day allows organizations such as the League of Women Voters, Connecticut NAACPs, YWCAs, and others to implement more voter registration and get out the vote campaigns. Early voting will allow us to partner more and do more to spread democratic principles and the right to reasonable accommodation to protect our right to vote. While YWCA Hartford Region does not endorse specific candidates for office, we strongly believe early voting should encourage candidates and their campaigns to spend more time and more focus on greater outreach to their respective constituents. Candidates and their campaigns can become more intentional about meeting voters and learning what must be done to help voters make educated and informed decisions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for letting us hear the YWCA's position. And it is now time for us to bring in our next speaker, Valeriano Ramos. Is Director of Strategic Alliances and Partnerships for Everyday Democracy. He's been there since 2010. He develops and implements a variety of outreach and partnership strategies to build alliances. He serves also as Everyday Democracy's Equity Officer, contributing to the organization's ongoing learning and practice towards addressing institutional and systemic racism and infusing racial equity practices within the organization and with partners. Val coordinates the Connecticut Civic Health Project. He has served as Director of Constituent Affairs for the Secretary of the State of Connecticut, Susan Bicewicz. There he handled constituent outreach and services, public policy research, minority business development, and Latino voter engagement efforts, which resulted in a 2007-8 unprecedented registration of 22,000 new Latino voters. Just what we like to hear. Val has served on numerous advisory and community boards and panels. He has been a trainer, a presenter, and keynote speaker at numerous conferences, including the National Conference on Citizenship, National Hispanic Leadership Conference, and the Connecticut League of Women Voters conferences. Val holds a BA in political science from Yale College and a master's degree in politics from New York University. So Val, we welcome you and turn the program over to Valeriano Ramos.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you, Carol, and thanks to the League of Women Voters for inviting me to be part of this conversation. Every democracy builds power with individuals and groups to advance multiracial democracies in their communities. We envision a vibrant, multiracial democracy where all people have access, resources, and power to create thriving communities. We provide training, coaching, and tools with a racial equity lens to support place-based engagement that promotes community-led and equitable solutions. Our strategies include community dialogues, also known as Dialogue to Change, leadership development, and inclusive community-driven civic engagement. Increasing civic engagement and voter participation, especially in communities of color, is an important goal for us, and we address it through the Connecticut Civic Health Project partnerships and Connecticut Civic Ambassadors Program. So at Everyday Democracy, we strive to elevate conversations that address the root causes, barriers, and disparate outcomes that institutional and systemic racism have created for communities of color. A January 2022 study by the Brennan Center for Justice documented how certain state voting rules and practices have made voter participation disproportionately difficult for Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. This includes strict voter ID laws, poll closings or consolidations, and purging of voters from voter rolls. The study found that the racial turnout gap grew when states enacted strict voter ID laws, and that the turnout effects continued even after the voter ID law was repealed. An aerial study in 2020, also by the Brennan Center for Justice, compiled national survey and cell phone data and found that voters of color around the country reported longer wait times in the 2018 midterms than their white counterparts in the suburbs. As we know, Connecticut has not been the exception. In 2010, for example, the Connecticut Post reported that Bridgeport election officials had at their disposal only 21,000 paper ballots, despite there being 69,000 registered voters in the city. The Connecticut Post reported that, and I quote, not enough ballots at many polling stations caused long lines, and ballots had to be photocopied and delivered to the polls by police officers. Furthermore, quote, a recount of the Bridgeport vote tallies found that about 1,500 of the nearly 6,000 photocopied ballots that were used when the polls ran out of regular ballots were incorrectly counted, never counted at all, or misrepresented on the city's final returns. Because of these and other delays, voting was extended for 2 hours to accommodate voters, mostly voters of color, who waited in lines for up to 2 hours. Another example, reported by Connecticut News Junkie and Connecticut Mirror. In the November 2016 general election, voters in New Haven and other large cities experienced huge lines and long waiting times. In New Haven, for example, voters waited in line in excess of 2 hours, and a polling site had to wait 15 minutes to get replenished with paper ballots, very much like what happened in Bridgeport. Then Secretary of the State Denise Merrill expressed concerns about polling sites in those cities not being able to or prepared enough to handle the large number of voters who showed up to take advantage of the newly adopted Election Day registration law. How ironic, isn't it? Lastly, and most recently, during the November 2020 election, NBC Connecticut reported that, quote, while the voting process was smooth in most areas on election day, one precinct in Hartford experienced long lines throughout the day. Evidently, this has been a pervasive phenomenon in the state's larger cities whenever there has been an unusually high voter turnout than expected, and even when that has not been the case. Now, we consider the fact that, generally speaking, voters in communities of color live in high population density centers, such as Bridgeport, New Haven, and Hartford. These problems will persist. And if you add the fact that many voters in those communities work 2 jobs, have higher incidence of health problems, are single heads of household with children, and often depend on public transportation to get to the polls, voting tends to be more time-consuming and difficult for them. Needless to say, early voting would remove many of those barriers for voters in communities of color. Thank you.
Thank you, Val. Some important examples, I think, of how early voting might be able to help us. So next, I would like to introduce Patricia Rossi, who is a member of the League of Women Voters of New Haven, but also on the board of the Connecticut League. She's been interested in electoral politics since canvassing for George McGovern in 1972. After years of school, career as a book editor and publisher, and raising children in multiple states, she came to Connecticut in 2016 and became involved in the New Haven League. Patricia has enjoyed registering voters, monitoring public housing elections, providing educational presentations to community groups, and acting as a league convener. During the 2021 and 22 legislative sessions, she worked with legislative specialists in the state league to protect voting rights, reproductive rights, our environment, and open government. She uses the skills she acquired cajoling authors, salespeople, and bookstore managers to write, sell, and buy books to motivate new voters, volunteers, and legislators to expand voter participation in Connecticut. Welcome, Patricia. We invite you to give us a few words.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. I'm so glad to be here with my fellow panelists and hearing the passion they have, as we do, the League of Women Voters, to support democracy and to support voters. The League of Women Voters mission statement is to defend democracy and empower voters. And as been alluded to previously, never is that more important than right now. Never is our democracy really been under more duress, and never has it been more important to encourage people to participate in our democracy, to feel part of our civic society, and to make their voices heard. This comes easily to us as the League of Women Voters. Our history is based in the suffrage movement. Women fought long and hard for the right to vote. And now that we have it, we have worked hard to make sure others have access to the ballot as well, and that people are educated so that they can make the choice that is best for them and their communities when they get to the ballot box. We strongly feel that voting is a right. And it was very interesting to me. I did some research on the history of voting in Connecticut to give talks about early voting in this season, when we're so concerned that people know about the early voting referendum and that they get out there and they vote yes. That I found out in the 70s, Connecticut's Constitution was amended to change voting from being a privilege to being a right. And I just think that's terribly important, because if you think voting is a right, then you have to make it accessible. You have to make it easy for people to vote. And in this world, this 21st century world, where everything is available 24 hours a day, and everyone, that means people are working 24 hours a day. And those people might not be able to get to their polling place between 6 a.m. and 8 p.m. And if we want everyone to participate in our democracy, we're going to have to adjust to the modern world and realize that, that just doesn't cut it for a lot of people, as Val Ramos said and others said. So we strongly support early voting, as we did election day registration, online registration, everything that makes voting, helps people participate and be part of our civic society. So we're advocating very strongly for a yes vote. We think this is not political. Some people think it is. We feel it is a nonpartisan issue. If we're all part of this democracy, if we all want to have, a great community, everyone needs to make their voice heard. So that's what we've been doing. That's what we've been pushing through education, advocacy at the state legislature, which got this on the ballot. And we look forward to helping the legislature figure out how to enact early voting in the state of Connecticut. And we can get out of the company of Mississippi, Alabama, and New Hampshire. Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. Also with us is Dr. Debbie Dukoff-Barone. She has been a very important contributor to the development of this program. She's a board member of the League of Women Voters with expertise in strategic planning and organization. Today, she is going to be asking questions that have been asked by the public, concerns that we know are out there. Debbie, are there a couple of high points that you would like to make at this, to present these questions and see if we have answers from our panelists?
Sure. And right before I do that, I'd just like to see if Dr. Brown Foster has some concluding remarks, some themes we may have heard from our panelists that she would like to offer.
Yes, I found the statements by our panelists to be really replete with a lot of textured and nuanced concepts and themes that I would really tease out in a classroom setting and cover, but I find them to be so important and crucial to the overall understanding of why early voting is one building block towards a truly comprehensive and strong democratic system. Ms. Cochran's comments, for example, especially the YWCA's origins, being coming out of the suffrage movement, being very involved in expanding voter opportunities for 51+% of the population. Women always make up the majority. And fundamental and key to the vote is that concept, your vote, your voice, representation through exercising the franchise, getting one's issues addressed, getting one's representatives elected who will represent and bring to the table, the policymaking table, those issues that are important to you as an individual, but also collectively. And as we know, the history of women's involvement, and especially even after the passage of the 19th Amendment, African-American women and other non-white women who were still disenfranchised, the vote is key and crucial. And one of the reasons that African-American women, for example, tend to be the most predictably reliable voters, not necessarily in terms of how they will vote, but fundamentally that they will vote. So representation is a concept that is definitely tied to elections, and it is an outcome of participation. And along those lines, Mr. Ramos's comments, Val's comments, also brought up this concept of a multiracial democracy. So not only do we have an expansion of inclusion on the basis of gender, but also a desire for the type of democracy that we're moving towards and the type of democracy we should want, and that is a multiracial democracy. It is not accidental, in my opinion, that some of the most difficult outcomes that occur on normal election days, that constitutional second Tuesday in November, the largest problems tend to happen predictably in certain communities, communities that have a long history of legal disenfranchisement. But I would call those problems that occur on the constitutional election day to be technical means of disenfranchisement. Democracy, and one of my introductory definitions about politics is the following: he, she, or they who make the rules, in fact, rule. And these type of decisions as to how we vote affect who can vote. How we vote will determine who is included and who is excluded. And some of these goals, some of these outcomes really rest upon mechanisms, how we do it, for example, how we implement this crucial right and privilege, even though in Connecticut it has transformed, it still remains both. And so finally, in Dr. Rossi's or Ms. Rossi's presentation, I found a very interesting through line to an outcome of elections and participation that very often is overlooked and not addressed. The more individuals and citizens participate in elections, the stronger our civic culture becomes. And it's that civic culture that creates the climate for discourse, that creates the climate in which citizens can disagree and do it agreeably, and creates the atmosphere in which polarization, which counters democratic discourse and civic culture, can be prevented. Participation, as fundamental as voting, is a throughway to greater participation and being included in the public space and the public square. Not only expanding one's voice through the vote, but also participation occurs in many other forms, running for elections. There's a direct through line to women's franchisement, and now women holding office all over the country. It is an integrated set of variables, but I found that Patricia Rossi's use of the term civic culture to be so important, because most of the institutions and organizations that the panelists are representing couldn't exist without an American civil society and civic culture, in which you can have the YWCAs that can speak out and achieve greater inclusion in the public space, or the League of Women Voters, or Everyday Citizen, or Everyday Democracy. Those are crucial to elections, because the policies that allow for the participation of these organizations really fall down to are reduced to voting, and who's doing the representing, and who's making the laws, and therefore orchestrating and creating the kind of political culture that we want to have, whether we want to have an inclusive, multiracial democracy, that's culture, one in which women participate, that's political culture, that's our civil society, that's our civic culture. So I find all of the presenters to be offering parts of a lecture that I would give over time in a particular class. And I think they're right on point. Thank you so much for making each of your observations.
Thank you, all panelists. Let's hone in now. What I'd like to do is hone in a little bit on the audiences that your specific organizations serve, your constituents, your communities. And let's talk about this early voting referendum that people will come to the polls on November 8th, have a question about amending the Constitution. What is it about this constitutional referendum and early voting that your audiences specifically might need to know, so that they would understand the importance of voting on this issue, on this referendum, when they come to the polls on November 8th? And we can start with Dr. Cochran.
Well, first of all, we want to make sure that we're in a position to inform the community about the importance of early voting. So much of the conversation that has happened here today, that we can share that with our communities, that they can understand that this is designed to make their lives easier, and it's going to give them more time to be able to vote. It will be more convenient. If you consider the number of Black people and other people of color who are working in service-oriented jobs, who may not have that one opportunity on that one specific day to be able to get out to vote, and you consider that they have to consider being off from work, you have to consider that childcare is an issue. It's just simply too restrictive. So the idea that you have alternative times to be able to do this is a very important message we intend to continue to carry. Also, the understanding that early voting helps to address already existing deeply rooted inequities in the workforce that prevent minorities and other low-income voters from participating in the electoral process. Understanding that early voting helps to defeat voter intimidation.
Thank you. Val?
Yes, I think because of the fact that communities of color are located in larger cities, as I mentioned, in Connecticut, Bridgeport, Hartford, New Haven, Waterbury, etc. And these cities, as I mentioned earlier, have been prone to problems and challenges for communities of color. One thing that those communities would want to know is, first of all, will there be enough ballots for them to vote early? And that when they vote, that the ballots will be counted, just as ballots are counted on election day. And also, they will want to know in advance where they would be able to obtain and cast their ballots in person, and that there would be sufficient polling sites to accommodate for what will probably be a higher voter turnout rate among people of color in those communities.
So I think that is a good question for a good point to be addressed by Patricia. What you think is going to happen here?
See that coming. So I think those are excellent questions. And this, one of our issues in Connecticut is 169 towns. 160, our elections are administered separately in 169 little municipalities. And so I think it's going to be important for people like you, Val, and for people like me and the rest of us to make our voices heard in the legislature next year when they're implementing early voting, because if the solution is designed to work well in a small town, it's not going to work well in New Haven, and it's not going to work well in Hartford or Bridgeport. If you have to go to City Hall to vote early, that's not really expanding access to the ballot very much. So I think we're going to have to think about how it's going to be implemented in Connecticut. One of the things when people talk about how hard it's going to be, as I say, 44 states have figured out how to do it. There's got to be a lot of good, examples out there about how you do this well. And coming to the party very late, as we are, gives us the advantage of having, the advantage of all those other people's, other states' experiences. So those questions are up in the air.
That's good. Debbie, do you have any other questions that
Sure.
we should address?
I think we'd like to know what your organizations in particular will be doing. Will you develop and execute strategies to inform your audiences that this referendum is on ballot this year? How will you help your constituents to know that this is part of their opportunity to let Connecticut have early voting?
May I?
Absolutely,
address-
Dr. Brown Foster, sure.
So I was thinking about it. My organization, I am in higher ed, and early voting can certainly benefit students as well.
Absolutely.
Who very often are disproportionately affected by voter access or polling access. And certainly this would benefit them as many of their issues remain unaddressed. And as it relates to some of the comments about the next phase, which would be the implementation, I find that to be extraordinarily crucial because it's one thing to legally provide opportunity, but then to technically take that opportunity away or make it even more difficult is something that we have to also guard against as those technical. So one of the limits of constitutional reform and legislation is that it isn't specific in terms of how to do it. But at the local and state level, when you get citizens involved in defining for themselves what is an effective way of doing something, you're once again expanding that civic culture that you raised, Patricia. So, democracy is not simply in the legislation, but in the doing as well, and coming up with collective solutions, even after the harder part, passing legislation occurs. And then one final thought in terms of going from the privilege to the right. The more actively involved citizens are, it really doesn't matter. It's just something that would just become so inherent in being a part of our country and the system. And it really is one of the greatest national security defenses to have all citizens feel as though they have a stake in the nation. I know that I departed a little bit, Dr. Barone.
That's good.
But, thank you for letting me speak and jump in.
Sure. So let's close the question and answer period with one quick, brief response from each of you. If there's one thing each of your organizations could do to help your audiences get out the vote and get them there to the polls to vote on this referendum, what would it be? Adrian, we'll start with you.
Well, certainly one of the things that we'll do, but let me add this first. We already have our Director of Community Engagement and Advocacy, Melinda Johnson, running a very aggressive effort in terms of get out the vote, voter registration, et cetera. So one of the things that we would want to do is to continue our partnership with the League of Women Voters. We would also want to make sure that we have a very targeted and specific social media campaign, and also working with our other sister YWCAs in the state as to issuing some sort of statement and joining together to do something to reach the communities that we all support at this time. It's without a doubt an incredibly important initiative and something that we'd have to make sure that people completely, fully understand what's at stake here. And we always have been for over 155 years, and we will continue to be advocates for simply doing what's right by the people we serve.
Thank you. Val?
Yes, Everyday Democracy has been part of the Connecticut Civic Health Advisory Group over many years, and we work with over 30 organizations that are all committed to increasing civic engagement in Connecticut, especially voting. So we work, for example, with the Connecticut Democracy Center, the Hartford Votes Coalition, with Common Cause Connecticut, with the League of Women Voters, of course, and numerous other organizations, as well as campus civic engagement groups, faith-based organizations, to really promote voting as an important part of civic life and civic culture, as Professor Brown Foster mentioned, how important that is. We believe in civic health as being integral to any kind of democracy that we want to sustain and advance, and especially bringing an equity perspective into it so that people of color are part of that practice and process of democracy. So one takeaway, of course, is that we understand the historical barriers that people of color have faced over the years, and that therefore early voting will make it possible for more and more voters of color to participate in elections. So we support it wholeheartedly.
Thank you. Dr. Brown Foster or Tricia, is there anything on that point you would like to add? Okay. Okay, let me just say that as we all move forward towards November 8th, if your organizations want to reach out to the League for help and support, please feel free to reach out to any of us. And now I'm going to turn it over to Carol.
Thank you very much. I am so pleased to have had all of you here. This has been a really inspiring discussion and will help us all, I think, to continue the push to make this early voting ballot question a yes for our state. and to provide more opportunities for people to actually get out and personally vote in a way that works with their schedules. And we know how busy schedules everyone has in this world today. So we thank you again. And I thank also the team of the League of Women Voters Greater Hartford that put this program together from a single email that asked, should we do something about early voting, do some kind of program? Joan Twiggs, Debbie Dukoff-Barone, and Libby Sweetek stepped forward, and I commend you for putting together a very, very good program, an informative program. So everyone out there listening to this program, please plan to vote on November 8th if you are going to vote in person. And if you are not going to be in town, or if you are ill, make sure you ask for, get an application for an absentee ballot, which you can do online at vote411.org, which is the League website, or to the Secretary of the State's office, and get your application sent in to have a ballot mailed to you. Make your voice heard on this very important voting referendum, as well as for all of the candidates that you wish to have representing you. So we sign off, and thank you all very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carol.
Thank you.
Thank you.